And welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Coming up on our program, an in-depth look at the death penalty and 2 ballot measures that seek to change it. And I'll talk with author Jeff Chang about his latest book on race relations. But first, today, just 11 days before the election, the FBI announced a new review of Hillary Clinton's emails. They were found during an investigation into former Congressman Anthony Weiner's illicit text messages with a teenager. Donald Trump praised the FBI's action, while the Clinton campaign is asking the FBI to provide more information. As part of our ongoing election coverage, we go now to PBS NewsHour's political correspondent, John Yang. John, nice to have you with us.
Great to be with you, Thuy.
Let's talk about that development today, about the new FBI review of Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server. So what does this mean? How serious is it? And what impact do you think it'll have on the presidential race at this point?
Well, it has the potential, Thuy, of being a game changer because there was nothing else that was likely to change in the political landscape. You had the last debate a couple of weeks ago, and then it was going to be the charge to Election Day. The other reason I think this could be a big issue, a big deal for the campaign, is that, number one, it's something that Donald Trump has been pounding on all campaign long, an issue that he's been using practically every day. And also, it plays on 2 things about Hillary Clinton that are already known vulnerabilities. Polls show that people think that she is less honest, less trustworthy than Donald Trump. So now this issue is coming up. Legally, we don't know how big a deal it is. We don't know what this new evidence is, but you can bet that Donald Trump is going to be pounding away on it for the next 10, 11 days. And in many ways, Hillary Clinton's going to be on the defensive.
So could this be not only a lifeline to Donald Trump, but also potentially to the Republican Party? We have a situation now where House Speaker Paul Ryan was in California this week trying to help out vulnerable Republicans. Will it be enough to save vulnerable Republicans like Darrell Issa of Southern California and Jeff Denham from the Central Valley?
That's right. I mean, that's been the big fear of Republicans, is the effect as the polls recently have shown a sort of a shift toward Clinton and suggesting that she might be opening up a big lead and might be headed toward a big win. There has been concern about what this would do to the congressional candidates, the Senate candidates, the gubernatorial candidates. You mentioned those 2 races in California. Darrell Issa's race has suddenly become competitive. Here's someone who's been in the House since 2000. And you can argue that he's got other problems going on now. He's not run a great race. He waited a very long time to go up on television. He's got a huge bankroll. He could have gone on TV in the summer and really buried his opponent in a big way, but he waited. Perhaps he waited too long, and now it's a competitive race. Jeff, you mentioned the other race in the Central Valley, Jeff Denham. He's had a little bit of a tougher race, a tougher history, but both of those competitive races this coming up in a couple of weeks.
All right, certainly the presidential race, once again, another surprise. It seems like every week there's a surprise. PBS NewsHour's John Yang, thank you so much for being with us. And now, a closer look at California's ballot. Since California reinstated capital punishment in 1978, nearly 900 death sentences have been handed down, but just 13 condemned inmates have been executed in that time. On Election Day, voters will decide on 2 dueling propositions to change the death penalty. One would abolish capital punishment, while the other is designed to speed up the process. KQED senior editor of politics and government, Scott Shafer, has more.
13 years ago, this picturesque shoreline was a crime scene connected with one of California's most notorious murders. In April of 2003, a couple walking their dog at Point Isabel Park in Richmond found the body of Modesto resident Lacey Peterson washed up on the rocks. The discovery came 4 months after she'd vanished from her home and just a day after the fetus of her unborn son was recovered less than a mile away. A few days later, her husband, Scott Peterson, was arrested and charged with murder.
We felt this was a proper case for the death penalty because of the nature of the crime, which in this case was a very premeditated, cold, calculated murder of a young woman who was pregnant.
After a trial that captured international attention, Peterson was convicted and sentenced to die. Birgit Flatiger was one of the lead prosecutors on the case. She's now the district attorney for Stanislaus County.
If Prop 66 passes, it will expedite.
Sharon Rocha, Lacey's mother, remembers the moment her former son-in-law's death sentence was handed down.
It was very overwhelming. I mean, you're sitting there and you're listening to a judge telling him that he will be put to death. But he didn't ask Lacey if she wanted to die. He took it upon himself to do that. He definitely deserves to be put to death.
The same year Peterson began his sentence at San Quentin Prison, another inmate reached the end of his.
The 51-year-old Williams is set to die by lethal injection at San Quentin Prison at 1 minute past midnight.
The execution of Stanley "Tookie" Williams in December of 2005 became a cause celeb, renewing media attention and debate over the death penalty.
Those who are without sin cast the first stone. He defended.
The next year, a federal judge in San Jose stopped executions over concerns about the state's 3-drug lethal injection cocktail. Even before that, the average time between conviction and a death sentence being carried out was about 20 years. San Quentin, with more than 700 condemned inmates, now houses the largest death row in the Western Hemisphere. Continuing litigation keeps the death row inmates in a state of legal limbo.
To impose death is a huge, huge step. I'm okay that it takes a period of time so that everyone is sure, but 10 or 20 years is too long.
Like most California district attorneys, Flatiger is supporting Proposition 66 on the November ballot. It would retain the death penalty and speed up executions by limiting time allowed for legal appeals. It would also require more attorneys to take death penalty cases.
I do think 5 years would be plenty to run the appellate process, especially if we have enough defense attorneys assigned to do the work that needs to be done.
11 years after he was sentenced, Scott Peterson still has no execution date. In fact, when I joined a media tour of death row late last year, I saw Peterson playing basketball with other condemned inmates. As soon as he saw journalists, Peterson stopped playing and turned his back to us.
It's hard on the victims. It's hard on everyone else to see him living his life and carrying on. That's not what his punishment was. His punishment was to be put to death. And I think it wastes a lot of money when they get to live for 30 years on taxpayers' money.
Stacy Boyers was one of Lacey Peterson's best friends. 13 years after her friend's death, she's still waiting for resolution as the appeals process drags on.
I do think we're going to have an answer from the California Supreme Court within probably 2 to 3 years. And
Sharon isn't sure if she'll live to see Peterson put to death. If the date does arrive, however, she doesn't plan to attend.
It's just not something I want to observe. Knowing that it is done that's enough for me.
Many supporters of capital punishment believe a death sentence brings a sense of relief and justice. But not all crime victims' family members agree on that.
Are you guys hungry or what?
Dionne Wilson lost her husband to a violent crime more than a decade ago. In 2005, Dan Nemi, a San Leandro police officer, was answering a public disturbance call. He didn't know that one of the men he approached was on probation and would do anything to avoid going back to prison. Irving Ramirez shot Officer Nemi 7 times.
At the time, my first thought was, he just needs to die. That's it. And I wanted it to happen right then.
But after Ramirez received the death sentence, Wilson says, instead of feeling a sense of relief, she actually felt worse.
I had always believed that getting a death penalty verdict would heal me. I believed all of the myths about it, that it kept communities safer, that it was a deterrent to crime, that it was cheaper than life without parole. And none of those things are true. 11 years have gone by, and now it's the last thing I want.
Over the years, Wilson has become an advocate for criminal justice reform. She's a strong supporter of Proposition 62, which would abolish the death penalty and replace it with life in prison without the possibility of parole. Like Prop 66, it also requires that inmates work and pay restitution to their victims.
Prop 62 isn't about coddling people who have murdered other people or have done horrible things. It's about how can we spend this money in a smart way? How can we prevent crime? How can we increase public safety by reinvesting these dollars?
Jeannie Woodford presided over 4 executions while she was warden at San Quentin. She feels the death penalty system is fundamentally flawed and should be ended.
It's been determined that the state of California has spent $5 billion on the death penalty and carried out 13 executions. The $5 billion is above the cost of keeping those individuals in prison for life without the possibility of parole. We could utilize that money in much more effective ways.
Another argument in favor of Prop 62 is that it would ensure the state never executes an innocent person.
We're making mistakes when it comes to the life of an innocent human being.
In September, the Yes on 62 campaign held a press conference with 17 death row exonerees from around the country.
The risk of executing somebody because of things that we might not know, like DNA, is just too high. The public often thinks, oh, well, now we have DNA. But the truth is there's DNA in just a small fraction of the cases. So you really cannot know for certain that everybody who's sitting on death row is guilty.
In 2012, voters rejected a ballot measure to ban capital punishment. Proposition 34 lost narrowly, and once again, polls show Californians divided.
What I would say to those who oppose the death penalty is, how would you feel if it was your daughter and your grandchild or any of your loved ones who was murdered?
If we do nothing, we continue to have a problem and a death penalty that doesn't work. If we abolish it, then we've just told all these crime victims' families, oh, all that work and all that grief was for nothing.
The whole system is so broken that there really is no repairing it. Let's follow much of the country and just end it.
All sides agree California's death penalty is not working. Voters will decide whether to try and fix it or scrap it altogether, or reject both ballot measures and keep the status quo.
And that was Scott Shafer reporting. I'm joined now in the studio by 2 guests, former death row inmate Shujaa Graham, who was exonerated in 1981. He supports abolishing the death penalty. And San Mateo County District Attorney Steve Wagstaffe, who supports expediting the process. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Shujaa, wanted to begin with you. Can you please tell us about the crime you were convicted of and then acquitted? And how has that experience on death row shaped your support for Prop 62?
In 1973, November 27, I had been in prison for over 3 years at that particular time. On November 27, 1973, an uprising happened in the prison that I was in, and a human being was killed, and his name was Jerry Sanders. Myself and Legene Allen was indicted by the grand jury. And for the next 8 or 9 years, we had to fight for our lives. In the first trial, the jury couldn't determine our guilt or innocence. It was there in my second trial I was convicted and sentenced to die at San Quentin. After being on San Quentin's death row for a few years, the State Supreme Court of California overturned our conviction. And it was there in my fourth trial, my third trial, the jury couldn't determine my guilt or innocence. And it was there in my fourth trial I was acquitted. And I left California's death row, and I made a commitment to end capital punishment because I believe capital punishment itself doesn't help resolve or reduce crime itself. It only intensifies violence. You kill me and I kill you. I think we as a people can secure society without resorting to have to kill someone to prove the killing is wrong.
If Proposition 66, which would speed up executions, if it had been in effect back when you were in prison, do you think you would still be alive today?
Oh, it's hard to say. As you remember, I started off in 1973 in my case. After 4 trials, it took me 8 years to actually prove my innocence. I'm just one of many that have you seen throughout the years that spent many years on death row and ultimately going through the appeals process, they was proven actually innocent. And people like myself wouldn't have had a chance if Proposition 66 would have been in effect, because it would have eliminated our appeal process.
So, San Mateo County DA Steve Wagstaffe, you support Prop 66, yes, keeping the death penalty but speeding up the execution process. Even if the appeals process could be reduced from an average of 25 years to 5 years, which is what Prop 66 calls for, how would that prevent innocent people like Shujaa from being executed?
Well, first of all, Prop 66 does not limit it to 5 years. And I heard the district attorney there, who I know well, say that is what she would like to see. It does not do that. It simply says that we're going to cut out some of the delay period. It will not happen in 5 years, I guarantee you. Because one of our goals is absolutely that atrocities like what happened to Mr. Graham don't repeat themselves. He was convicted and sentenced under a law that no longer exists. We're under a new law now that came in 1977 in California. And we want every single right. We don't want to eliminate any right of the people who've been convicted of these crimes to exhaust every appeal they can. No elimination of appeals, because I agree, that would lead to injustice. We don't want that. What we want is to reduce the time. I'll give you the easiest example, and that is on the last case we had in San Mateo County where death was returned by a jury in 2010. It was 5 years until an attorney was available to provide defense to this person on appeal. Well, that's 5 years of absolutely nothing happening. We want to try and eliminate that by this proposition is one of the things.
How would you eliminate that, though? Prop 66 essentially requires more attorneys to accept death penalty appeals cases and then train them to handle those cases. Where would the money for that funding come from? How would you implement it?
Well, the funding, of course, does have to come from our legislature. You know, what we have found in a variety of propositions in California, 47 and many others, is when they do put in mandatory stream of money, it doesn't happen. It simply doesn't happen. It will require the legislature to follow the will of the people if they choose to pass Prop 66 to give the funding for more lawyers and to do the training. Because I don't want there to be attorneys who don't properly defend, who sleep through or are intoxicated or anything like that. That's wrong, and I know we join together in opposing that. I want properly trained ones.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, we're putting into, if it passes, we're putting into place a law where there's really no funding yet to carry it out. Does that make sense?
Almost all initiatives are in that category, where they say to be implemented, it requires funding from our legislature in order to do it. And what has been found is initiatives that do include the funding, Prop 47 is my example, doesn't happen.
Shujaa, you were exonerated more than 30 years ago, and there are many cases like yours, but there are also those who are on death row who are indeed guilty. And for many victims, they've stepped forward in support of keeping the death penalty, saying that to them, capital punishment is the justice that they need. Are you denying them that justice by calling for an end to the death penalty?
No. I work with murder victim family members. My mother is a murder victim family member. Her brother was a police officer, and he was murdered. And my mother absolutely opposed the death penalty. Closure, the thing that they call closure, is a myth. I've worked with murder victim family members after the person was actually killed. They felt worse. They said, Shujaa, we really don't have anyone to hurt. Just because you oppose the death penalty, you don't want someone to be executed as a consequence of killing your loved one. That don't mean you love them less. But I just think, the death penalty is a bad public policy. And I think in order to evolve as a society, we must find other ways to deal with the crime that is being committed in our society without having to execute our citizens.
So Prop 62 seeks to deal with that by resentencing condemned prisoners to life without parole. Steve, why is that not a good enough punishment?
I'll give two quick reasons for that. Number one, there was one of the 13 people who was executed was a man named Clarence Allen. And he orchestrated his murder while serving a life sentence. He orchestrated his murder from inside prison. So for him, what would be the greater punishment? He's already doing life. The second is that if I could have a guarantee, and of the 50 or 60 forums and debates I've done, I've always asked, will you join me in making sure that life without possibility of parole will go for the next 50 or 100 years, and you will not touch it? And I have never had one taker on that, and all the opponents, I know that's the next step, is that they will say redemptive justice and we have to eliminate life without parole. I just can't support that.
Does capital punishment, though, keep communities safer?
I think so.
You think so?
Oh, I very much do. I'm not saying deterrent effect. I agree very much, Mr. Graham, on that. But in terms of, for these certain crimes that are so evil, so awful, I think it does keep our communities safer. I think it will. And I attended an execution of those 13, the one from San Mateo County. I was there with the victim's family 24 years after the crime. And I agree, there are many families that get no closure. This family did.
Shujaa, what do you think of what he just said?
Well, in terms of, I'm totally against capital punishment in its totality. And I'm also a person that I don't believe in and punishment itself. You violate our society, my first instinct, how do I secure society? And my next move is, how do I correct you and make you a better person? I'm not going to just cast you off because you did the worst thing. And I totally can understand how people is into a state of revenge. When I was released, I wanted revenge and everything, and I said, it wouldn't be a solution to the situation. The best thing I can do is make sure what happened to me never happened to anyone else without me raising my voice.
All right, we will leave it there. Shujaa Graham, a death row exoneree, and also San Mateo County DA Steve Wagstaffe. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you for having us.
From recent riots sparked by police-involved shootings of black men to Donald Trump's comments about Mexicans and Muslims, the issue of race has captivated and polarized the nation. Author Jeff Chang has been a frequent and outspoken voice on race relations in America. His new book is We Gonna Be All Right, a collection of essays exploring cultural conflicts from Ferguson to Hollywood. Jeff, nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So you had just finished writing a book on race relations in America when the Ferguson shooting happened 2 years ago, where police shot and killed a black man, Michael Brown. Mm-hmm. Why did you feel a need to write this book, We Gonna Be All Right, so soon after the other one?
Yeah, and it took me 20 years to write the first two.
And then how long did it take you to write this one? Just a matter of months,
Yeah,
right?
just a matter of months. I got it done in about 6 months total. But, you know, really what I wanted to do was to, like thousands of others, see firsthand the movement in Ferguson. And so I went for the anniversary of the killing of Michael Brown on August 9th, 2015, and was there and came back and wanted to write about the sort of gap between the picture of diversity that we have and the rising inequalities that we see, especially along racial lines.
In fact, in your book, you contend that we are pretty much back to where we were 20 years ago in terms of race and segregation. Why do you say that?
Well, the facts show that school desegregation, for instance, peaked in 1989. And what we've seen over the last 20 years in housing, especially in the Bay Area, has been gentrification. But gentrification is part of this larger process of resegregation that's going on. What we see with gentrification is what's happening in the cities. But what happens to those who are displaced? Where do they go? They move to suburbs with names like Ferguson, Missouri. And so I wanted to kind of capture that and also to look at what's been happening even in the popular culture. So talking about the Oscars So White controversy and talking about the continuing sort of overwhelming whiteness of our cultural sectors, the folks who lead our cultural sectors as well.
In fact, the title of your book, We Gonna Be All Right, comes from pop culture. And in it, you also talk about Beyonce. And I wanted to get your thoughts about that. And even Colin Kaepernick right now, who has made headlines. Are they contributing to the discussion? Or do you feel that sometimes people are turned off by that and it may hurt their careers? I know that's not always a motivating factor for them. But how does that play into the larger picture of pop culture's role in race relations?
Well, you know, a lot of what we like to say actually is that cultural change precedes political change, that you don't really see political change until you can have the imagination to imagine what that change could look like. And so in that regard, you know, what artists are doing, what musicians are doing, what athletes are doing, what folks like you are doing in the media is being able to show sort of a different face and a different kind of lens into what another world could look like. And I think in that regard, it has been, you know, polarizing to see different kinds of protests. But I think it forces the question of racial justice back to the front burner, which I think we've kind of suppressed over the last 50 years. We've not had a national consensus for racial justice in a half century.
And speaking of seeing things from a different lens, you yourself have a different lens on things, right? You were born and raised in Hawaii. You're Asian American. How has that experience shaped your perceptions of race relations?
Well, I think Asian Americans have a really unique kind of vantage point. We are poised as in between, you know, in between black and white, in between complicity and freedom in a lot of respects. And so we have the privilege in some ways to be able to step out of battles over race and maybe even choose sides. We're going to stay back and pick the winner And I think that this isn't a moment where we can afford to sit on the fence anymore. This is a moment where we have to be able to see where this country is going and what we need to be able to have. You know, we're all going to be minorities very soon. And so we've got to be able to look at racial justice questions, especially in this particular moment when things seem to be so divided. This is a moment that we can turn it around.
And so, of course, there's been a lot of talk about this, not only because of the riots related to officer-involved shootings, but also the presidential race has put it very much in the forefront. So it's one thing to have this conversation that these problems exist, but what about the solutions? What do you propose we do?
Well, I'm better at diagnosing than I am at coming up with solutions. But one of the things that I think needs to be done is for folks to be able to look at what's happening and to think about what they can do immediately in their particular communities.
Such as?
I mean, the basic thing of having conversations about this. The race conversation in this country is always halted by folks deciding that they don't want to talk about things, that they'd rather avoid talking about racial justice questions. And I think that that's the minimum that you can do. But what can you do in your community, in your schools, in your churches, in the places that you get together to go to eat or to go to enjoy football games on the weekend or that kind of thing, and to be able to kind of have those kind of conversations, but to think in a larger sense about where you want your kids, your grandkids to be able to be around these questions, and to know that as long as we've got racial injustice, or as long as we've got racial inequality happening, we're not going to be able to move to a place where we're all going to be together.
The essays in your book, actually, much of it made me very sad. The fact that we have made so little progress over the decades, but the title is very optimistic. We gonna be all right. Real quickly here, 15 seconds. Are we really gonna be all right?
I think so. You got to have a reason to get up in the morning. So, you know, that's what I'm writing towards, and that's what I'm hoping that we're all pushing towards.
All right. Well, Jeff Chang, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your perspectives.
Thank you for having me, Thuy.
That does it for us. I'm Thuy Vu. Thanks so much for watching. For all of KQED's news coverage, please go to kqednews.org.